Marcus Reeves knew the sound of hunger. It wasn't the gentle growl of a skipped breakfast or the hollow ache of a missed lunch. True hunger had a voice that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the bones, a whisper that turned men into ghosts and ghosts into memories. He'd heard it in the trenches of Proxima during the expansion wars, watched it hollow out soldiers twice his size until they were nothing but uniforms draped over skeletons. Now 15 years after the treaties were signed, and the heroes came home to parades he'd been too broken to attend, he heard that same whisper every night in the slums of New Cardiff. The difference was that tonight, the hunger wasn't his own. Marcus sat with his back against the crumbling wall of what had once been a spice warehouse, before the economic collapse turned this entire district into a graveyard of failed dreams. The structure still smelled faintly of cardamom, and something sharper he couldn't name, mixed now with rust and the acrid bite of chemical rain that fell every third day when the atmospheric processes malfunctioned. His coat, military surplus from a war nobody wanted to remember, was wrapped tight against the evening chill. In his lap sat a container of synth protein stew, still warm from the charity kitchen 6 blocks away. His only meal today. His only meal tomorrow, too, unless he got lucky. But luck had never been his companion. Not in the war, where he'd lost half his squadron to friendly fire that command later called acceptable casualties. Not in the aftermath, where his PTSD and the tremor in his left hand made him unemployable. And certainly not in the years that followed as he drifted from shelter to shelter, watching the world rebuild itself without him. He was lifting the spoon to his mouth when he heard it, a sound so soft he almost dismissed it as wind through broken windows. A whimper. No, 2 whimpers, slightly out of sync. Young voices, the kind that hadn't yet learned that crying attracted the wrong kind of attention in places like this. Marcus turned his head slowly, scanning the debris-strewn alley. The sun had already dipped below the skyline, and the streetlights in this district had been dead for 8 months. But his eyes had adjusted to darkness in bunkers and caves on 3 different worlds, and that training didn't fade just because the war ended. There, in the gap between 2 collapsed shipping containers, something moved. He should have ignored it. Every survival instinct he'd honed over decades of barely existing told him to eat his food, keep his head down, and mind his own business. Nothing good came from poking into dark corners in this part of the city. But Marcus had spent 15 years telling himself he was still human, still capable of being more than the hollow shell that stared back from puddles when it rained. And humans, real humans, didn't ignore the sound of children in distress. He set down his container carefully and pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting. At 47, he felt 70. The tremor in his left hand worsened as adrenaline trickled into his system. Old battlefield instincts waking up like sleeping dogs that only knew one trick. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by disuse and the pneumonia he'd never quite recovered from last winter. "Anyone there?" The whimpering stopped. Silence pressed in like a held breath. Marcus took 3 careful steps forward, hands visible and empty. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" A shuffling sound. Then, slowly, something emerged from the shadows between the containers. His first thought was that he'd finally snapped, that the stress and malnutrition had broken whatever fragile threads still tethered him to sanity, because what stood before him couldn't possibly be real. 2 small dragons, each no larger than a terrier, crept into the faint light. Their scales were the color of tarnished silver, with hints of deep blue that seemed to shift and swirl like oil on water. They had the long serpentine necks of the draconian species he'd seen on news broadcasts and propaganda posters during the war. But these were young. Cubs, he realized. Their wings were folded tight against their bodies, membrane so thin he could see the delicate bone structure underneath. Golden eyes, slit-pupilled and luminous, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that he recognized instantly. They were starving. It was obvious in the way their ribs showed through their scales, in the dullness of their hide, in how their legs trembled with the effort of standing. One of them swayed, and its sibling pressed closer, offering support they both clearly needed. Marcus had seen draconians before, of course. They'd been humanity's allies during the expansion wars, their aerial superiority and fire-breathing capabilities turning the tide in battles that would have otherwise been slaughters. He'd even fought alongside a few. Though communication had been minimal, they were assigned to different units and command had been paranoid about fraternization with non-human forces. But he'd never seen draconian cubs, especially not alone, in a human slum, looking at him like he was their last hope before the darkness swallowed them whole. Jesus, he breathed. Where are your parents? The larger of the two, perhaps marginally less thin than its companion, made a sound that might have been an attempt at speech. It came out as a croak, the click and whistle language of their species broken by exhaustion. Marcus knew he should walk away. Getting involved with alien children, especially draconians, was asking for trouble he couldn't afford. There were laws, protocols, entire bureaucracies designed to handle this kind of situation. He should report this to someone. The authorities, social services, the draconian embassy, if they'd even talked to someone like him. Instead, he found himself thinking of the stew growing cold on the ground behind him. His only meal. The one thing standing between him and another night with his stomach trying to digest itself. He looked at the cubs. They looked back, wings drooping, tails dragging on the dirty ground. Marcus had done a lot of things he wasn't proud of. He'd killed on command, watched friends die while he survived, and spent years drowning in self-pity and cheap alcohol when he could get it. But he'd never been the kind of man who could watch children starve when he had the power to help. Even if helping meant going hungry himself, even if those children had scales instead of skin. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. "All right." He returned to his spot against the wall and picked up his container. The cub's eyes tracked his movement with laser focus, their heads following the food like flowers toward sunlight. When he sat down and patted the ground beside him, they hesitated only a moment before scrambling forward with desperate, clumsy movements. Up close, they were even worse off than he'd thought. Their scales were dry and flaking in places, and one had a cut along its shoulder that hadn't healed properly. They smelled of smoke and fear and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, though he couldn't explain why. Marcus scooped a spoonful of stew and held it out to the nearest cub. It stared at the offering for a long moment, then glanced at him, then back at the food. Suspicion warred with hunger in those golden eyes. "It's okay," Marcus said softly. "It's not much, but it's safe. Probably tastes like cardboard, but it'll keep you alive." The cub leaned forward, sniffed delicately, then opened its mouth. Its teeth were small and sharp, designed for tearing meat, but it took the stew gently from the spoon, careful not to bite his hand. It swallowed, shuddered, and made a sound that might have been relief or gratitude, or simply the pleasure of a belly no longer completely empty. The second cub pressed closer, and Marcus spooned out another portion. They ate slowly at first, then faster as they realized he wasn't going to stop, wasn't going to take it back. He alternated between them, making sure each got equal shares, watching the container grow emptier with each spoonful and trying not to think about what tomorrow would feel like. When it was gone, the cubs looked marginally better. Not healthy, they'd need weeks of proper care for that, but no longer on the immediate edge of starvation. They huddled against each other, and then, to his surprise, pressed up against his side. They were warm. Dragons ran hot, he remembered from briefings, something about their fire-producing organs and accelerated metabolism. The heat seeped through his thin coat, and Marcus realized with a start that he'd been cold for so long, he'd almost forgotten what warmth felt like. "Your parents," he said quietly. "Where are they?" The larger cub made another clicking sound, this one softer, sadder. Its sibling buried its face against Marcus's side, and he felt the small body shake. Understanding settled over him like cold rain. These cubs weren't lost. They were orphaned. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. His hand, the one with the tremor, came to rest on the nearest cub's head. The scales were smooth under his palm, cool to the touch despite the warmth radiating from its body. "I'm so sorry." They stayed like that as night fully claimed the sky, three broken souls sharing warmth and grief in the ruins of the old world. Marcus knew he couldn't keep them. He couldn't even keep himself. But for tonight, for just a few hours, he could offer them the one thing he'd been denied since the war ended, the knowledge that someone cared whether they lived or died. What Marcus didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that they weren't alone in the alley. High above, Perched on the roof of a building that should have been condemned years ago, a figure watched with eyes that burned like molten gold in the darkness. She had been tracking her children for 3 days, staying close enough to intervene if true danger threatened, but far enough that she wouldn't be seen. Couldn't be seen, because the Queen of the Draconian Reaches was supposed to be dead, murdered alongside her mate in the palace coup that had shattered their civilization 6 months ago. Seraphina Flamewing had let them believe it, had fled through secret passages while her guards died buying her escape, had hidden her children in the cargo hold of a human transport ship, and had followed the refugees to Earth when her home world became a death trap. She'd shed her crown, her name, her very identity, all to keep her cubs alive. And now she watched a homeless human veteran, a man who had nothing, was nothing in the eyes of his own society, give his only meal to her children without hesitation. She watched him speak to them with gentleness, touch them without fear, offer them the warmth of his presence when he could have simply walked away. She saw her cubs, who had known only flight and fear for months, finally relax against him as though they'd found something they'd been searching for. Safety, kindness, simple human decency from someone who had every reason to have lost faith in such concepts. Seraphina's claws dug into the concrete of the roof, gouging deep furrows. She should retrieve her children now, under cover of darkness, before this got complicated, before the human became attached, before she made the mistake of hoping that maybe, just maybe, not all warmth had fled from this cold universe. But she didn't move, couldn't move, because it had been so long since anyone had shown her children kindness, without knowing they were royalty, without wanting something in return, without the weight of politics and expectations crushing every interaction into a transaction. This human asked for nothing, expected nothing. He simply gave because he could, because some core part of him remained intact, despite whatever horrors had carved those lines into his face. She would watch, Seraphina decided, just for tonight. Just to see if this was real, or simply a prelude to some trap she hadn't anticipated. And if he proved false, if this was some elaborate scheme, or if danger found her children, well, the humans had learned during the war what happened when you threatened a dragon's young. She settled into her vigil, silver scales catching starlight, wings folded tight against her body to minimize her silhouette. Below, the veteran began to hum, some wordless melody that might have been a lullaby, or simply the sound of a man who'd forgotten he wasn't alone. The cub's eyes drifted closed, and Seraphina, queen in exile, guardian of a scattered people, felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the night her mate died, a fragment of hope. Marcus woke to sunlight stabbing his eyes, and the realization that something was very wrong. The wrongness resolved itself into 3 distinct facts. First, he'd fallen asleep sitting up against the warehouse wall. Second, the cubs were still pressed against him, creating a warm pocket that had probably saved him from hypothermia. Third, and most concerning, there were voices approaching from the mouth of the alley. Saw them go this way. 2 cubs, silver coloring, has to be them. You're sure? Because if we haul back regular ferals, Vex is going to skin us. I'm sure that coloring, that's royal bloodline, and you know what exotic animal collectors pay for that. Marcus's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning chill. He knew those voices, or rather he knew the type. Traffickers, the kind who'd moved from drugs and weapons to more exotic merchandise after the war, opened up trade with dozens of alien species. There was a black market for everything now, including rare creatures, including apparently draconian cubs. The cubs stirred, sensing his tension. The larger one looked up at him with those unsettling golden eyes, and Marcus saw understanding there. They knew those voices. They'd been running from them. Stay quiet, he whispered. Stay behind me. He pushed himself to his feet as 3 men rounded the corner into the alley. They wore the kind of clothes that tried too hard to look casual, expensive synthetic fabrics, attempting to mimic the weathered look of streetwear and failing. Their leader, a tall man with facial tattoos depicting some corporate logo Marcus didn't recognize, smiled when he saw them. Well, looks like someone found our lost property. These aren't property, Marcus said, keeping his voice level. They're children. The tattooed man laughed. They're animals, old-timer. Cute ones, sure, but animals. Now step aside and we'll even throw you a finder's fee, say 100 credits. Marcus didn't move. The tremor in his left hand worsened, but he'd learned long ago how to work through it. "They're under my protection." "Your protection?" One of the other men, shorter, with the augmented muscles that came from cheap black market mods, stepped forward. "Look at you. You're homeless, probably half-starved. You think you're going to protect anything?" The truth of those words should have stung. They didn't. Marcus had long since accepted what he was, what his life had become. But acceptance didn't mean surrender. "I'm also a veteran of Proxima and Kepler 442b, he said quietly. "I've got 17 confirmed kills and 3 combat commendations, and before you think those shakes in my hand mean I can't fight anymore, let me explain something about muscle memory." He shifted his stance slightly, weight-balanced, right hand drifting toward his belt where he kept a utility knife that had once been standard military issue. It wasn't much of a weapon, but he'd made do with less. "It doesn't forget." "Not really. So you can try to take these cubs and maybe you'll succeed. But I promise you won't walk away without scars." The tattooed man's smile faded. "There's 3 of us, old man. 1 of you." "I know. Hardly seems fair." Marcus felt something shift inside him, the cold clarity that had always descended before combat, the removal of everything except the immediate moment and the actions required to survive it. But life rarely is. For a long moment, nobody moved. Marcus could hear his heart beating, slow and steady, the way it always did when violence became inevitable. Could feel the cubs pressed against his legs, trembling but silent. Could see the traffickers calculating odds, weighing profit against risk. Then a shadow fell over the alley, and calculation became irrelevant. She descended without sound despite her size. One moment the sky was empty, the next a dragon stood between Marcus and the traffickers. Not a cub, but a full-grown draconian, easily 12 feet tall at the shoulder, with wings that blocked out the sun and scales that shimmered like moonlight on water. Her eyes were the same golden color as the cubs, but ancient, terrible, filled with a fury that made the morning air crackle with heat that might have been actual flame or simply the promise of it. When she spoke, her voice resonated in the chest cavity, bypassing ears entirely, some kind of subsonic component that made her words felt as much as heard. "You will leave, now." The traffickers ran. They didn't discuss it, didn't try to negotiate, didn't even look back. They simply turned and fled like prey animals who'd suddenly realized they were in a predator's den. Marcus stood very still. The knife in his hand suddenly seemed laughable, a child's toy in the face of this creature, who could probably bite him in half without much effort. But he didn't lower it, didn't step away from the cubs who had pressed themselves even harder against his legs. The dragon turned to look at him. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw something he hadn't expected: recognition, respect, and beneath both, a weariness that matched his own. "You defended my children," she said, and her voice was softer now, lacking the edge that had sent the traffickers running. "Why?" "Because they needed defending." His answer came without thought, simple truth that required no embellishment. She studied him for a long moment, head tilting in a gesture that reminded him eerily of the cubs. "You gave them your food. Your only food. They were hungrier than me. You stood against 3 armed men with nothing but a utility knife and false bravado. The bravado wasn't false. I really would have killed them if they'd tried to take the cubs." Something that might have been amusement flickered across her massive face. "Yes," she said, "I believe you would have tried." The cubs had finally detached themselves from Marcus's legs and were scrambling toward their mother with high-pitched cries of relief and joy. She lowered her head, and they pressed against her, their small forms dwarfed by her bulk. She made a low rumbling sound that Marcus felt in his bones, some kind of purr or reassurance in the draconian language. Then she looked at him again, and he saw her properly for the first time. Saw the notched edge of one wing, the scarring along her shoulder that spoke of recent violence, the way she held herself with the careful control of someone who was injured but refusing to show weakness. She'd been in a fight, recently, and from the looks of it barely survived. "You're hurt," he said. She stiffened. "That is none of your concern." "Probably not, but those men weren't just random traffickers. They knew your cubs specifically, knew their coloring, knew they were valuable. His military training, dormant for so long, sparked to life. They're hunting you, all of you. Again, not your concern, human." "Marcus, My name is Marcus Reeves. He finally lowered the knife, sliding it back into his belt. And maybe it's not my concern, but those cubs slept against me last night because they had nowhere else to go. That makes them a little bit my business. The dragon regarded him with those ancient eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like an open book. Finally, she dipped her head in what might have been a nod or simply acknowledgement. "I am Seraphina," she said, offering nothing more. No clan name, no title, nothing to indicate who or what she had been before this moment. "Are they your only cubs, Seraphina?" "Yes, and their father." Her eyes hardened, scales rippling with some emotion he couldn't identify. Dead. Marcus understood that kind of dead, the kind that came with violence, with injustice, with the universe being cruel for no reason at all. He saw it in the set of her shoulders, the protective way she kept herself between him and her children. "The men who killed him," he said quietly. "They're the ones hunting you." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. "You are perceptive for someone in your condition." "My condition?" "Broken, discarded, forgotten by your own kind." There was no cruelty in the observation, just fact delivered with the bluntness of someone who no longer had energy for social niceties. Marcus laughed, a short, sharp sound, without much humor. "Yeah, that's pretty accurate." "Then why do you care what happens to us? We are not your responsibility. You owe us nothing." It was a good question, the kind of question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to share his food instead of eating it. He thought about telling her about the war, about the draconian soldiers he'd fought beside, about the debt he felt humanity owed her species. Or he could mention the simple human decency that said you didn't let children starve when you could help. But in the end he settled on the truth that was simpler than all of that. "Because I'm tired of not caring about anything, and your cubs looked at me like I mattered. It's been a long time since anyone looked at me that way." Seraphina was quiet for a long moment. Around them the city was waking up, distant sounds of traffic, the hum of atmospheric processors, the thousand small noises of civilization continuing its indifferent march forward. But in their alley time seemed suspended, held in the space between heartbeats. "This shelter you stay in," she said finally. "Is it safe?" "I don't stay in a shelter. Can't handle the crowds, the noise. Too many triggers, too many reminders of barracks and bunkers and nights when the bombs fell so thick you couldn't hear yourself scream. I have a place. It's not much, but it's private. Show me." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. Marcus nodded and began walking, very aware of the massive dragon and her two cubs following behind. He led them deeper into the industrial district, where the buildings stood empty and forgotten, where squatters like him had carved out small territories among the ruins. His place was the basement of an old textile factory. The ground floor had collapsed years ago, but the lower level remained structurally sound if you knew which supports to trust and which to avoid. He'd found it 8 months ago and had slowly made it livable, clearing debris, patching the worst holes, even rigging a rain collection system that gave him semi-clean water. It wasn't much. It was barely anything. But it was his. Seraphina examined the space with a critical eye, her head nearly scraping the ceiling. The cubs immediately began exploring, sniffing at his meager possessions with the boundless curiosity of children who'd been running too long to indulge such impulses. "You live here," she said. Not a question. "Yeah. It's insufficient. It's what I have." She turned to look at him, and something in her expression had shifted. "Those men will return, with more numbers, better weapons. They know the cubs were in this area, and they will search systematically until they find us. Probably. You cannot defend against that. I cannot defend against that, not in my current state." She lifted one wing slightly, and he saw the extent of the damage, tears in the membrane, burn marks along the edge that suggested energy weapons. "I am still healing from my escape. My fire is weak. My flight is limited. I am, like you, broken." Marcus heard the admission for what it was. Not weakness, but trust. She was telling him this because she'd decided he needed to know, which meant she'd decided something else too. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "An alliance. Temporary." She lowered her wing, wincing slightly at the movement. "I need somewhere to hide while I heal. My cubs need food, safety, shelter. You need—" She paused, golden eyes studying him. "Purpose, I think. A reason to care whether you survive another day." It should have offended him, that blunt assessment of his life. Instead, he found himself nodding. "In exchange," Serafina continued, "I can offer protection once I've healed. Resources, when I can safely access them. And perhaps most valuable in your world, I can pay you." "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want, Marcus Reeves?" He looked at the cubs, who had settled in the corner he used for sleeping, already claiming it as their own. Looked at Serafina, proud and damaged and trying so hard not to show how desperate she was. Looked at his own hands, trembling but still capable, still able to hold a knife, still able to offer food to those who needed it. "I want to help," he said simply. "That's all, just let me help." She regarded him for a long moment and then, impossibly, she smiled. Dragons probably weren't supposed to smile, their faces not really built for that kind of expression. But there was no mistaking the warmth that entered those golden eyes. "Then we have an agreement, Marcus Reeves. You help me keep my children alive, and I will help you remember why your own life is worth living." He held out his hand, the human gesture probably meaningless to her. But Serafina extended one massive claw, and they sealed their bargain with the gentlest handshake Marcus had ever experienced. Neither of them mentioned the obvious problem, that whoever was hunting her cubs had resources and determination, and that this rickety basement would be a coffin rather than a sanctuary if they were found. Neither mentioned that Marcus was half-starved and broken, or that Serafina was injured and far from the sources of power that might have protected her. They were, both of them, refugees from their own lives, discarded by the worlds that had once needed them, now trying to survive in the margins and the shadows. But they were no longer alone, and sometimes that was enough to tip the balance between giving up and pushing forward one more day. Outside, the sun climbed higher, indifferent to the small alliance being forged in the basement below. And in an office across the city, a man with trafficker contacts and government connections received a report that made him smile. The cubs had been spotted, and this time they'd been seen with both a homeless veteran and an adult dragon. Perfect. 2 problems solved with 1 operation. He began making calls. The first few days established a routine that felt almost normal, if you ignored the fundamental strangeness of a homeless veteran cohabitating with a dragon queen and her cubs. Marcus quickly learned that draconians required more food than he'd anticipated. Not just quantity, but specific types, high in protein and certain minerals he'd never heard of. His daily trips to the charity kitchen became strategic missions, supplemented by careful theft from restaurant waste bins, and one memorable evening when he'd traded 3 days of labor at a recycling plant for a crate of expired protein bars. Serafina watched his efforts with what he'd learned to recognize as approval. She couldn't leave the basement during daylight, too conspicuous, too risky. But at night she would take flight on damaged wings to hunt rats and other vermin in the industrial sector. It was beneath her dignity, he suspected, but she did it without complaint, bringing back her catches for the cubs who weren't yet skilled enough to hunt for themselves. They didn't talk much at first. She was clearly unused to human company, and Marcus had spent so long alone that conversation felt like a language he'd half forgotten. But silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. They coexisted like 2 wounded animals sharing a den, wary, but united by necessity. It was on the 4th night, while the cubs slept and Serafina tended to her wing with careful attention, that Marcus finally asked the question that had been building. "What happened to you?" She didn't look up from her grooming. "What makes you think something happened? You're hiding in the basement of a ruined factory on a backwater planet. Your cubs don't speak Draconian in front of anyone but you, and you flinch every time you hear sirens." He paused. "Also, you fight like someone who's seen recent combat. The way you positioned yourself against those traffickers, that wasn't just parental instinct, that was military training." Her head swiveled toward him, eyes narrowing. "You are more observant than you pretend. Old habit. Kept me alive during the war. The expansion wars, you fought in them. Yeah, 3 campaigns, 2 deployments, more battles than I care to remember." His left hand trembled, and he pressed it against his thigh. "Your people fought with us. With humanity. Some of us did." There was something bitter in her tone. "Others believed we were being used as cannon fodder for human ambitions. Were they wrong?" She turned back to her wing. "No. But neither were they entirely right. The expansion wars were complicated. Multiple species, multiple agendas, multiple definitions of what victory would look like." Marcus waited, recognizing the pattern of someone working up to a painful truth. My mate, Serafina said finally, believed in the alliance, believed that our people could find prosperity and security by working with humanity and the other allied species. He argued for integration, for trade, for cultural exchange. Her claws scraped against the concrete floor. Others believed he was selling our heritage, betraying our traditions. They killed him for it. They called it justice, said he was a traitor to draconian independence. Her voice remained steady, but Marcus could see the tension in every line of her body. They murdered him in front of the royal court. Would have murdered our cubs too if I hadn't gotten them out. Royal court. The words hung in the air between them. You're not just any dragon, Marcus said slowly. You're royalty. I was. She finally looked at him, and he saw the weight of loss in those golden eyes. Queen Serafina Flamewing, sovereign of the draconian reaches, voice of the mountain clans, guardian of the sacred flames. Now I am simply Serafina, refugee, fugitive, and mother trying to keep her children alive long enough to grow up. Marcus absorbed this, fitting it into the puzzle that had been taking shape in his mind. The traffickers. They knew your cubs were valuable not just because they're draconians, but because they're royal. Yes, there are collectors who would pay fortunes for them, museums that would display them, and worse, she shuddered. There are political factions who would use them as hostages, leverage against any resistance to the new regime. They cannot allow any royal bloodline to survive. That's why you're here. On Earth. In the slums where nobody looks twice at refugees. I chose this city specifically because of its refugee population. Thousands of displaced beings from dozens of species, all trying to survive in the margins after the war. I thought we could disappear here, blend in. She made a sound that might have been laughter or despair. I did not account for how difficult it would be to hide when one is a 12-foot dragon with distinctive coloring. Marcus considered this. You need papers. Forged documents that give you legitimate status, maybe a cover story. Say you're a war widow seeking asylum. Such documents require money I don't have and contacts I cannot risk making. But I can make those contacts. He saw her skepticism and pushed forward. I'm nobody, invisible. I can move through parts of the city you can't, talk to people who would run from a draconian but will barely notice me, if I'm careful. No. The word was final. You've already risked enough. Why do you care? He threw her own question back at her. I'm broken, remember. Discarded, forgotten. Why does it matter if I take a few risks? Because my children have already lost their father. Her voice was sharp enough to cut. I will not let them lose the first person since this nightmare began who treated them with basic kindness. The admission hung in the air, more vulnerable than anything else she'd revealed. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some long dormant instinct toward protection, toward mattering to someone. I'll be careful, he said quietly. Marcus, you need those documents, and more than that, you need information about who's hunting you, how organized they are, what resources they have. He met her eyes. I spent 3 years in military intelligence before I was transferred to combat. I'm rusty, but I remember the basics. Let me do this. She studied him for a long time, and he could see her calculating risks, weighing her desperate need for help against the ingrained instinct not to trust anyone. Finally, she dipped her head in reluctant agreement. But at the first sign of danger, you extract yourself. Promise me. I promise. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but some lies were kinder than truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus became a different kind of ghost. He haunted the fringes of the black market, the grey zone bars where humans and aliens mixed in violation of a dozen regulations nobody enforced. He listened more than he talked, bought drinks he couldn't afford for people who knew people, and slowly assembled a picture of the threat they faced. It was worse than he'd hoped. The coup that had killed Serafina's mate hadn't just been a factional dispute within draconian politics. It had been backed by a human corporation, Helix Industries, one of the mega-corporations that had profited enormously from the expansion wars. They'd supplied weapons to both sides, built fortunes on the suffering of entire species, and now they were expanding into exotic acquisitions. The cubs weren't just valuable as museum pieces, they were leverage in a larger game. Helix wanted control of draconian mining operations, access to resources that the old royal family had refused to sell. With the cubs as hostages, they could force concessions from the new regime, or simply eliminate the last of the bloodline and ensure no future challenges to their puppet government. And they were getting close. The street-level traffickers Marcus had encountered were just the tip of the organization. Helix had dedicated an entire security division to finding Serafina and her cubs, complete with alien trackers, automated surveillance, and enough money to buy information from anyone desperate enough to sell it. Marcus reported all of this to Serafina in careful installments, watching her grow more tense with each revelation. "We need to move," she said after his latest update. "Find somewhere else to hide." "Where?" Marcus gestured around the basement. "Any place we go, you'll be visible. They have surveillance drones mapping refugee sectors, thermal scanners that can detect your heat signature through walls. Every day you stay still increases the odds they'll find you, but every move risks exposing your location. Then what do you suggest?" "I suggest we stop running." He pulled out a data pad he'd traded a week's food rations for, its screen cracked but functional. "I've been thinking about this backward. We can't hide you. You're too distinctive. But maybe we don't need to hide you." He brought up a news article, turned the pad so she could see. "There's a draconian community on the north side, immigrants mostly, workers who came here during the war and stayed. Not large, maybe 300 individuals, but established, legitimate. You want me to join them?" Serafina's tone was skeptical. "They would recognize me. News of the coup spread through all draconian communities. Some would recognize you, but would they turn you in?" He watched her carefully. "You said your mate believed in integration. That means he had supporters. People who think the new regime is wrong. Maybe some of them are here." She was quiet for a long time. "It's a risk. Everything's a risk, but right now isolation is killing you. You need proper food for the cubs, medical attention for your wing, information about what's happening back home. The community could provide that. Or they could provide my location to those hunting me." "Yeah, they could." Marcus set down the pad. "But I don't think they will. I've been watching them, talking to some of the younger ones who come into the charity kitchens. They're angry about the coup, scared about what it means for draconians who've integrated with human society. If you revealed yourself, asked for sanctuary, I would be putting them all at risk. Helix would target the entire community. They're already at risk. Helix doesn't distinguish between royal draconians and common ones when it comes to exploitation." He leaned forward. "You were a queen. Maybe it's time to remember what that meant. Not just crown and title, but responsibility, leadership. Your people need you." Her eyes flashed, and for a moment he thought he'd pushed too far. Then her scales rippled, some emotion he was learning to read as acknowledgement. "You speak boldly for a human who has no stake in draconian politics. I have a stake in keeping your cubs alive. That's good enough for me." She regarded him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You are not what I expected, Marcus Reeves." "Yeah, well, you're not what I expected either. Turns out the universe specializes in surprises." As Marcus and Serafina forged their fragile pact in the cold, forgotten basement, a profound truth began to emerge from the shadows of their broken lives. It wasn't merely an alliance of convenience between a queen in exile and a forgotten veteran. It was a testament to the enduring power of compassion, the unexpected ways grace can manifest, and the quiet dignity found in selfless acts. This unfolding narrative, woven with threads of sacrifice, vulnerability, and a burgeoning hope, serves as a powerful reflection for each of us, illuminating the deeper currents of the human, and indeed, the universal spirit. Consider Marcus, a man hollowed out by war, abandoned by a society he once defended, left with nothing but his scars and a profound sense of isolation. His world was one of scarcity, where survival hinged on the simple act of eating his single, meager meal. Yet when confronted with a hunger more desperate than his own, a hunger embodied by the vulnerable dragon cubs, he did not hesitate. He gave his last, not from an abundance, but from the very core of his emptiness. This act transcends mere generosity. It is an echo of ancient sacred teachings that remind us of the divine spark within, the capacity for boundless love that exists even in the most broken vessels. It speaks to a fundamental truth that true giving often begins precisely when we believe we have nothing left to offer. In that moment of profound self-sacrifice, Marcus wasn't just feeding two starving creatures. He was nourishing his own dormant soul, rekindling the flame of purpose that had been extinguished for far too long. He rediscovered his own humanity, not in grand gestures or heroic battles, but in the simple, quiet decision to choose compassion over self-preservation. And then there is Seraphina, the queen in exile, stripped of her crown, her mate, her kingdom, left with only the fierce instinct to protect her young. Her journey brought her to the fringes of a human city, a world alien and hostile, where her royal lineage meant nothing but a death sentence. She watched Marcus, a human she had every reason to distrust, an outcast from his own kind, extend a kindness that defied logic. This wasn't a calculated political move. It was pure, unadulterated decency. In Marcus's trembling hand, offering a spoonful of stew, Seraphina witnessed not just an act of charity, but a glimpse of a different kind of strength. A strength rooted in empathy, untainted by power or expectation. This experience, observing the raw, unburdened goodness of a stranger, began to mend not just her physical wounds, but the deeper lacerations of betrayal and loss. It reminded her that even in a universe consumed by conflict and ambition, there remained pockets of pure, unadulterated grace. Her decision to trust him, to form an alliance, was not merely a tactical choice. It was an act of faith, a queen learning to lean on the most unlikely of saviors, acknowledging that sometimes the greatest help comes from those who, by worldly standards, have the least to give. Their shared brokenness, once a source of despair, became the very foundation of their burgeoning strength. This narrative holds a powerful mirror to our own lives. How often do we, in our own struggles and perceived scarcities, forget the profound capacity we have to give? Do we wait until we feel whole, until our cups are overflowing, before extending a hand to others? Marcus reminds us that true compassion flows not from abundance, but from the heart's willingness to share what little it has. It challenges us to look beyond the labels we assign, homeless, refugee, other, and see the inherent divine worth in every being. In a world that often measures value by status, wealth, or power, this story gently nudges us to reconsider. It suggests that our greatest treasures might not be what we accumulate, but what we are willing to release, what we are willing to sacrifice for the well-being of another. The practical application of this profound narrative resonates deeply within our daily existence. We are all in various ways like Marcus and Seraphina, broken, wounded, exiled from some former state of grace or wholeness. We carry the scars of past battles, the weight of unfulfilled expectations, the quiet despair of feeling forgotten. Yet just as Marcus found purpose in protecting the defenseless, and Seraphina found solace in unexpected kinship, so too can we unearth meaning and healing in our own lives. It begins with the courage to look beyond our own immediate needs and recognize the subtle cries of hunger around us, not just for food, but for connection, for understanding, for a simple act of kindness. Perhaps your last meal isn't food, but your time, your patience, your undivided attention to someone who feels unseen. It might be the willingness to suspend judgment, to offer a listening ear without immediate solutions, or to share a comforting presence when words fail. Just as Marcus's act was initially small, yet incredibly significant, so too can our daily offerings transform lives. Consider the individuals in your own communities who are marginalized, forgotten, or simply struggling in silence. They may not be dragon cubs, but they are vulnerable souls in need of a compassionate touch, a validating glance, a moment of genuine human connection. This story also invites us to embrace our own brokenness, not as a source of shame, but as a potential pathway to profound connection. Both Marcus and Seraphina, in their vulnerability, found each other. It was not their strength or their perfect facades that drew them together, but their shared wounds and their desperate need for solace and protection. In a society that often pressures us to project an image of unwavering strength and self-sufficiency, this narrative offers a liberating truth, that true alliance, true community, is often forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability. When we allow ourselves to be seen in our imperfections, we create space for authentic connection, much like the warmth the cubs offered Marcus and the trust Seraphina placed in him. Seek out those unlikely alliances in your own life, the people or groups you might typically overlook, whose perspectives and experiences could offer unexpected strength and insight. Remember that sometimes the most powerful advocates for justice and compassion emerge from the very margins of society. The courage to step into the unknown, to trust beyond fear, is a powerful act of spiritual defiance against the cynicism that often engulfs our world. Let us now pause for a moment of collective reflection and a gentle invitation to action. Close your eyes if you feel comfortable and take a deep breath, allowing the spirit of this narrative to settle within you. Consider the hunger in your own heart, perhaps a hunger for purpose, for connection, for meaning beyond the mundane. And then reflect on the last meal you possess, the precious resource, however small, that you might be called to share with a starving soul, human or otherwise. In the quiet sanctuary of your own spirit, ask yourself, where am I being called to extend unexpected kindness, to offer my unique last meal to someone in need? Who are the cubs in my life, the vulnerable, the overlooked, the silenced, who desperately need my protection, my advocacy, my simple presence? Where do I need to shed the armor of self-sufficiency and embrace my own vulnerability, allowing myself to be seen and supported in an unlikely alliance? Let us affirm this commitment, not as a burdensome obligation, but as a joyful response to the stirrings of our deepest compassion. May we cultivate a discerning heart that sees beyond appearances, recognizing the inherent royalty in every being, regardless of their circumstances. May we have the courage to stand against injustice, even when it feels daunting, knowing that even a utility knife wielded with righteous intent can deter formidable adversaries. May we remember that even when we feel broken and discarded, we are never truly without purpose when we choose to love, to serve, and to connect. And so, as Marcus and Seraphina embark on their perilous journey, now united by a bond stronger than steel, may we too step forward in our own lives with renewed hope and determination. May you carry the profound lesson of this story within your heart, that even in the darkest corners of a forgotten world, light can emerge from unexpected sources. May you find strength in your vulnerabilities, purpose in your compassion, and profound connection in the most unlikely of alliances. May peace, born of selfless giving, reside within you. May hope, kindled by acts of unexpected kindness, illuminate your path. May courage, drawn from the deepest wells of your spirit, empower you to defend the defenseless and to seek justice for the oppressed. And may you always remember that no act of kindness, however small, is ever truly lost, for it ripples through the fabric of existence, weaving new patterns of grace and creating a world where even the most broken among us can find healing, redemption, and a reason to believe in the enduring power of love. Go forth carrying this spirit, and be a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needs your light.